Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and today I am here with another Warcry meta video. It has been a while. I skipped it in the spring. Mostly I was expecting an FAQ, which we didn't get, which is fine because Warcry event attendance has been still just kind of trucking along, even as the game's sort of official support from GW has dried up. People keep showing up to events, which is really awesome, and lets me keep talking about the meta because it keeps existing, which is wonderful to be able to say. Today I'm going to start with a slightly different table than what I usually start with these meta videos, mostly because I think that this sort of winner's circle table is telling us actually a little bit more than the normal win rate stuff does. And this is an analysis of how many events have been won by each faction since the last sort of big change in the meta, and sort of what percentage of people showing up. So like domination percentage is a somewhat dramatic way of saying what percentage of the people who show up with a faction just win all their games or like win the tournament with that faction. And it is wild that almost 30% of people who show up with Wildercore Hunters just end up winning the tournament. That's insane. A normal domination percentage would be 0.12. That's because some tournaments are 3 rounds, some tournaments are 4 rounds. For a championship equivalent, I'm calling if you're undefeated with only 1 draw or 0 draws. So 3-0, 2-0-1, 3-0-1, and 4-0. So no losses over the course of your tournament and only 1 draw or fewer. That's calling it a sort of championship equivalent. A lot of the time you'll see in tournaments the two people who have the most impressive run through the tournament, they end up meeting in round 4, taking each other out by drawing, and then the person who's had the third most impressive run ends up winning. And for those big tournaments that end up happening that way, you would say that those actually produce 3 championship equivalents, essentially, right? Some tournaments produce none, where no one has better than 3-1 as a record. Depending on, sometimes like a 10 to 14 person tournament can end up with those results. So it's a little bit messy, but I think it tells a pretty clear picture once you look at it, which is that Wildercore is absolutely dominating. When people bring Wildercore Hunters to a tournament, they do very well, and that they've done it at volume. There are a few here that also have very, very high percentages here, and I'll talk about them, but they haven't proven as replicable as Wildercore has. Slaanesh of both varieties is doing very, very well when people sort of build it in anger. And the reason there is that Vexmore is still really good. I think a lot of the top players online will kind of dismiss Vexmore, partly because a lot of Vexmore lists don't have a lot of interesting tricks to them. There's really only Vexmore's sidekick, which is Vashtis, that has that -1 attack bubble aura that I've found to be incredibly powerful when I've run Demons of Slaanesh a few times now. Never in a competitive tournament, but like in a whole bunch of sort of casual testing circles, I've run it, and I've found that -1 attack bubble to be very powerful, but not particularly fancy. Like you don't get to like pat yourself on the back and call yourself a genius when you just run Vexmore, his sister sidekick, and just like a bunch of Demonettes or a bunch of Bliss Brews, and then like Slake Slash. They're very straightforward lists. They're just like, our chaff is faster than your chaff. You're not going to be able to catch our chaff. We're going to force you into sort of bumping up against the rock that is Vexmore, and then our fast fighty thing is going to go hunt down your chaff while that's happening. It's just a very simple game plan, which I think maybe some of the top players get bored with, but it is performing. And when good players show up with it, they tend to win. They tend to win a lot of their games. And, you see people... You're just seeing these a lot of the time also at tournaments, maybe not winning the tournament, but going 3-1. And so does very well. And you can absolutely still win with this, even though I think it's kind of receded from the online discourse of what's good. Royal Beast Flayers is kind of a secret sauce of a faction. Only 12 people have shown up with it in tournaments, but 3 of them won. That's pretty impressive in my mind, and I think more people should be trying it out. It's very, very powerful. There's a specific way you want to run it with just a lot of ghouls, a baron or 2 barons, and then you've got your leader, and maybe you ally in just like 1 hitty piece, and that's it. So like a wielder of the blade fits really well. You could fit a few other pieces in death that can fight, but overall you're just putting a lot of ghouls out. You're running around and using pack tactics to win. You'll also notice that Soulblight Gravelords in the next slide doesn't have a very high winning percentage, and technically this domination percentage is kind of average. A lot of people show up with Soulblight Gravelords, but there's a reason it's won 8 events, and it's not by accident, where when you do build the right Soulblight list for the pack and for the matchups that you're going to face, you can absolutely go 4-0 with it, like really solidly. And we've seen that in the stats. It is partly due to just like pure numbers that's happening, but there's more to it. It's not just brute force where it's happening, because Gloomspite Gitz isn't here, right? Because the more wins you have, the harder it is to get that last one, and so the good Soulblight lists are able to do that, which is just very notable. Now, with this kind of as background, I think it's worth going into the win rate chart. I joke around, we call this the parfait on my Discord. If you do want to have some more in-depth conversations about the Warcry meta, feel free to join my Discord. Also, make sure that you like and subscribe if you haven't already. For this video, the more you like it, the more people will see these kind of more visible videos to see that people are still playing this game and having a lot of fun with it, and that there's a lot to talk about as far as the different factions that are doing well. So let me talk about how I have color-coded this. Red is the chi-squared function, is essentially a function to tell you how much outside the bounds of the null hypothesis are the results you're seeing. So the null hypothesis being like, if your warband was just a flat 50% of the time going to win in every single game, how likely would it be that it would achieve these results? And so if it's over 4, that can be pretty concerning, but it is sort of a variation, if you would say. And so I've kind of color-coded things where we're pretty sure that you would not be able to see results like this if the faction was normal, if the faction was just like regularly inbounds 50% win rate. And that's what red is. Yellow is a little bit more dubious. So for example, either the win rate is really scary, like for example, Royal Beast Flayers or Demons of Nurgle, but not at a high sample size for what the win rate is. Or it's something like Cruel Boys, where the win rate's not that crazy, but we've got so many games at this point, 214 games with Cruel Boys, that having 57% win rate over that many games is actually a pretty decent indicator that something might be off. If you got up to 300 games with Cruel Boys and it still was at 57%, you'd feel very comfortable saying that Cruel Boys is messed up, statistically. White is very questionable, right? The win rate is out of bounds a little bit, but it's probably fine. We can't really statistically say that it's fine or not. That's where human judgment comes in. That's where, a reasonable person has to say what they think. And, really you can fall back on your own personal experience. And then the green ones are we can pretty clearly say that the average way people are playing these factions is definitely pretty average. There will be things like Monster Killers or Soulblight Gravelords or Hunters of Huanchi where a broken build does exist, but it's being balanced out by the crappy builds that are being built there. It's not like you can just roll out of bed and win everything with these factions. It's not like these factions are breaking down the doors of the meta. One thing to remember, though, is that the data only describes the people. The data never describes some platonic castle in the sky ideal, right? So the people run Demons of Nurgle a certain type of way. People who run Demons of Nurgle tend to be trying really hard. They tend to be trying to prove something because Demons of Nurgle used to attract all the tryhards back when it was busted. people who run monster killers often tend to be screwing around, often tend to be bringing one box. So the fact that there is a broken build of monster killers, the fact that monster killers has some of the most powerful options at their points costs in the game, doesn't necessarily show up in the stats because a lot of people are bringing fairly messy monster killer builds. So that's something where you'll see that the tier list that I'll put later in this video won't necessarily be going purely based on the stats, but the stats are important to me because they are what grounds the conversation. If you have some argument for why one of these lower win rate warbands is actually totally busted, you need to be able to make a coherent argument, in my opinion, for why it's losing, for why people are running it wrong, something like that. And for an example of that, I would say Jade Obelisk is not nearly as bad as its win rate. It's been run a few times as a staff bot, which is partly dragging it down because the numbers are not very high. But when I looked, there really weren't that many times when Jade Obelisk was run as a staff bot. I think it was only 2 or 3 times. Otherwise, people running the build of it that I think is really good, they both just went 2 and 2. And so, you know, I am going to be taking Jade Obelisk to a tournament in about 6 weeks. I don't think it's a 4-0 army at all. I'm not even sure if it's a 3-1 army, but I do need to find out, and I'm really interested because I do think they're better than the stats suggest, but I really wouldn't go around saying that they're super good because, you know, that's what we've got in the numbers. Some of the things at the top of the meta, they're in red. First, the 2 Slaanesh win rates are a real testament to Vexmore. You know, we see Slaanesh sort of winning a lot in terms of actually winning tournaments when it shows up. We also see it winning a lot in terms of win rate when it shows up. And that's because these are the ones pretty much every time someone runs Demons of Slaanesh or Humans of Slaanesh, they pretty much always bring in Vexmore because it legitimately fits narratively and it just feels right in there. It also synergizes really well. Slaanesh is really fast, Vexmore is really slow. That sounds overly simplified, but it's really not. Vexmore is just very good at being like a solid rock in the center of your formation, and then the rest of your warband can kind of orbit around him. And that's what Slaanesh is very good at as long as Vexmore continues to exist. And so they are just going to continue to win a lot of games. The other thing I think we can say here is that crossbows are a real problem. We see some really bad Wildercore Hunters lists enter into tournaments. Not to say anyone's a bad person or a weak player for bringing them, but just one box Wildercore Hunters doesn't really do a ton. The melee guys are generally pretty disappointing in terms of what they do. They do have some cool abilities, actually. The melee guys have some cool tricks they can do, but they are just very vulnerable for their points costs. And so we would almost expect to see Wildercore to be, yes, very high in terms of wins, but maybe much more down to earth in terms of win rate. But the win rate's still very high at 61%. And so at 150 games at this point, I feel pretty comfortable saying that Wildercore is a little cracked. The same is true with Skaven. Skaven doesn't win quite as many tournaments as Wildercore does, but it seems like the floor is a lot lower. So even though maybe fewer people are winning their tournaments with Skaven, you know, 2 fewer wins, but 9 more people running, so a much lower percentage are winning. The actual win rate is basically right there, and that's because it's very rare that you find someone who's able to find a build of Skaven that is goofy enough for them not to at least go 2 and 2. You know, it does happen sometimes, but for the most part, there's not a lot you can do in Skaven to really mess it up too badly because the battle trait is just so devastating for your opponent in terms of being able to bring in new reinforcements for free that aren't on your roster. You basically just get a free 140 points when you're playing Skaven, and so that can be incredibly powerful, and some of the synergies that you can make with that are really powerful as well. I think also we've seen enough from Gloomspite Gits and Chaos Legionnaires to say that there is something very wrong with these factions. There was a There we go. So there was a player, Jack Buckland, who managed to go 3-1 with Gloomspite Gits very recently at a UK tournament. Warcry UK presents the Ravaged Coast. I think this is the one at UKGE. And this is pretty close to how I would run Gloomspite if I wasn't going with Mollog. You see a lot of stuff all over the place with Gloomspite. But this as a very reasonable, like you've got a Boggle-Eye, you've got a Clawback, you've got a Netter with Prog, so you've got two Netters going on. You've got the Shrewmancer, which has a really nice little disruptive component here. There are things you can do with Gloomspite Gits that are fairly respectable, but in general, we've seen enough to be able to say that the average builds of Gloomspite Gits that are out there are just really, really difficult to win with, and that's represented in a 39% win rate that is replicated across quite a few games. Chaos Legionnaires doesn't have nearly as many games, but the win rate is so much worse at 32%. I think we've seen enough from Chaos Legionnaires. Friends don't let friends play Chaos Legionnaires. That's just how it is. Yellow, some interesting things going on here. One is Ogre Maw Tribes and Cruel Boys. The ogre leaders that make ogres and cruel boys really, really busted are kind of like covered in a little bit of noise. Most cruel boys lists don't include an ogre leader. Most ogre maw tribes lists do have one, but not all of them. And a lot of them, when I say an ogre leader, I mean specifically Crushers, Gutlords, and Tyrants. I don't mean the rest of them. I mean like the pure combat ogre leaders. A lot of people in ogres will bring like some of the cooler ogre leaders for what it's worth. Like the Bloodpelt Hunter is incredibly cool, or the Butcher is incredibly cool, and both of those fighters don't suck. So like you can absolutely run them and have a straight face, but they're not like killing the competitive meta, right? And so the few times when people are bringing those terrifying pieces, those are kind of having to yell through the noise. But you're seeing it in these win rates that both factions have a lot of play, and still pretty reliably high win rates. But they're not necessarily completely busted. They're that 57 to 59% win rate is within the range that we wouldn't accept this in a card game with actual an actual competitive play department that cares about the meta. But in miniatures games generally, I mean in GW games especially, we pretty much accept anything below 60% as being reasonable. But the top builds of these two factions are anything but reasonable. Down at the bottom with yellow, Night Haunt, I think it's an interesting thing where in very specific metas, like it has a decent percentage of winning tournaments, because you can sort of, if you're in the right meta, you can just get paired against a bunch of bespoke factions, and Night Haunt just like completely invalidates bespoke leaders, but they're kind of bad at doing anything else. You can, if you can play really cowardly with Night Haunt, you can win certain objective missions, especially on Ferocious Gnarlwood. One of our local guys, Danny, managed to go 3-1 at Adepticon with Night Haunt, just by basically running away the whole tournament. Danny said that they basically spent the whole tournament retreating, and would just like counter punch every once in a while when the opponent put something out there that was very killable, and maybe a little bit too valid, like any high points cost glass cannon fighter. They would just like counter punch on that and then spend the rest of the round running away. And that's a play style that is very hard to execute. Well, it's very easy to execute, but it's hard to make yourself execute it, if that makes sense. And so that's why I think that Night Haunt is at a very low win rate, even though I think a lot of people take Night Haunt pretty seriously. There's just like a lot of issues with, just being so killable in certain missions. As far as some of the ones in white that are interesting, KO is interesting because yes, there are 4 tournaments, one with KO, but none of them are 4-0s. There's a couple 3-0s. I have 2 of those, and then there's some 301. But it's really hard to just like tromp your way through a tournament with KO, because you'll just really often just lose to the mission once. They just don't, they're just so slow and they don't have the movement tricks. And if they ally in the one movement trick in order that they can really make use of, it just takes so many points for a fighter that doesn't fight, that you just kind of lose the benefit of being KO. So they're very, very powerful, but I think it's, there are reasons why they haven't joined the top, even though there's plenty of games under their belt. It's also something where, I've seen a lot of people say that they need to be touched, need to be nerfed. My win rate with KO is in the low 70s. The non-me win rate is, I think, just exactly 50. And I think that there's just like a lot of flaws with the faction, but they are very powerful, which is why they still end up here, at a reasonable place. Some of the ones lower down, like Iron Golems, Gorger Mawpack, Castellites, Dark Oath Savagers, Rotmire Creed, Untamed Beasts, Slaves to Darkness. These are very chill UK tournament core factions. One of the things that I think a lot of the people in the UK love is that people tend not to bring the spiciest stuff. Or at least when they do, there's only like a few people at the tournament doing that. But one thing that does happen is those tournaments end up very populated with these sort of chaos bespoke warbands and sort of chaos bespoke core. Like Dark Oath is not a chaos bespoke, it's a AOS warband, but it feels very chaos bespoke-y, right? And so a lot of it's very popular. Same with Slaves to Darkness. These warbands, I think, if anything, their win rate is probably inflated a little bit, where, for example, I think Iron Golems is the most powerful of those ones that I just listed by a pretty large margin. But Iron Golems has a fairly low win rate, and the reason is because Iron Golems is so popular, it gets brought out at a lot of events, not just like the types of events that tend to focus on like the more chill, the more like platonic Warcry factions, because that's what all these are, right? Like Rotmire, Savagers, Untamed Beasts is the first core set, Iron Golems. These are all just like platonic Warcry factions. And they're all really struggling, in my opinion, but their win rates aren't quite as low as they could be because they tend to show up at the same tournaments and fight each other. And then they just kind of go 50-50 against each other. And that puts some noise into the numbers so that they don't look quite as bad as they really are. Here we do have an interesting sort of bit that we can talk to expand onto the Bespokes conversation about whether or not Bespokes are bad. And I think there's something interesting here where the overall win rate of Bespoke factions for Warcry, so Warcry specific factions, is 47%, which is fine. But I think it's notable to say that only 9 of the 29 warbands are in a positive place. And, when you look at maybe not positive, but at least like high negative, like say, 45% for Dark Oath Savagers, 45% for Rotmire Creed, that only brings it to 2 more. So you're only getting 11 out of 29. So it's when people say that Bespokes are terrible or that the game's not about Bespokes, it's not that there aren't any good ones, because there really are, but there's just so many that are just really hard to run. And again, like I said before, a lot of these have somewhat inflated win rates because they tend to show up at tournaments that are dominated by each other. So situations where these chaos Bespokes especially, but a lot of these Bespokes that are in that 40% area, when they do show up at tournaments with a lot of compendium factions too, their win rate against compendium teams is very, very low. So James, please, take a look at some of the Bespoke factions. I would love it if our next round of, of just FAQ or whatever, if we get one, I really hope it focuses on a lot of these factions, especially the most recent 4. You can see Riverblades and Twistvelt, I think is how it's pronounced. Those are so not compelling that people aren't even bringing them. Like, people just don't touch them. The same is true of Claws of Karanak. It is so bad that just people aren't playing it. The few people who have had a really bad time. Um, I would love to see some action on those. Pyregeist and Tyrannic Cohort aren't quite as bad. They're just kind of regular bad, but they could use some love as well. So there's a lot of bespoke factions that could use some love, even though there are some really good ones. And the best faction in the game is Wildercore. And I used to be someone who would get frustrated when people complained online that bespokes weren't any good and that this was an all compendium game, because I was like, what are you talking about? Like, Horns of Hashut, which was good at the time. Horns of Hashut is like completely busted. It's one of the 3 best warbands in the game by far. Like, what are you talking about? The bespokes aren't any good. But it's just, even when individual ones prove to be the exception, just as an overall situation, it is quite rough. So that brings me to the tier list, something I'm excited about, something that a lot of people skip to. So if you are just arriving at the video, hello, I'm not mad at you. I'm perfectly happy to have you because this is fun for me too. Also, if you are getting to this video from Goonhammer, great website. I'm very excited to post this there. It's been a while since I posted on that website, but this one is something that I'm excited to kind of bring to the larger wargaming community, since Goonhammer is sort of the paper of record for the wargaming community. So let's just start talking about the tiers. I feel pretty comfortable only using 5 tiers now. There was a while when I had kind of a B plus and a B minus tier, and most of the factions were in B. I have felt fine just kind of dropping a lot of the factions that have not proven their worth into C tier. That said, I think most of C tier is pretty cool. Like, I was just talking about how Gloomspite Gitz really struggles in tournaments, but the thing is, only 2/3 of the factions even have enough play to really get into tournaments. When you just get into casual play where everyone's playing whatever they want, Gloomspite's fine. Gloomspite is completely fine. And, they've got, like, you can build your warband around Sneaky Snufflers. Sneaky Snufflers are pretty solid. They're not amazing, but, like, they're just a nice little rock at 12 wounds that'll just survive long enough that whatever, like, the cool thing is that your warband does, you'll be able to do it. And you've got the Gabapalooza, which are cool. Like, you've got a lot of sweet stuff you can do, and that's true of pretty much everything in this C group. Even, I would say, Cypher Lords, which should probably be down in D tier, but Cypher Lords just have the cool teleport tricks. They have, they have some fun to them that is sort of pretty compelling, even though I would never bring one to an event. I think they're perfectly reasonable when you're just kind of playing them for fun. And so, all of these, I'm happy to talk in the comments if your favorite faction is one of these. Things like Quester Soulsworn have a terrible win rate for good reasons. But I've played them in a bunch of casual games, and they're fun. They feel really smooth. They never feel like they can't do anything. You just lose close games with them if your opponent knows what they're doing. That's just what happens when you play Quester Soulsworn, because you get the bonus actions, right? And you get bonus actions for doing, like, every different thing, right? Like, you scratch your ass, you get a bonus action, and it's really cool. But you don't, like, just get them for free. You just have to, like, work for them, plan for them, and so it's a very fun little faction. But your opponent's usually going to find a way to outscore you. That starts to clean itself up a little bit as we move up into B tier. Pretty much everything in B tier has something that's pretty darn compelling. And so you'll see, for example, some factions that people don't play. So, like, nobody plays Spire Tyrants, so they aren't in the win rate stats. Or Night Haunt has an incredibly low win rate. But these are factions that are still capable of really powerful things. Night Haunt in a bespoke heavy meta is absolutely terrifying. Spire Tyrants is able to put just, like, very powerful netters into play in every deployment group. And when I say powerful, I just mean, like, fairly points efficient for 65 points. The Spire Tyrant's netter, if he gets stuck in a chaff versus chaff fight, he can hold his own, which is not true of most other netters. he's got 10 wounds, and so he's able to take a lot of punches from basically anything that's not like a dedicated combat master. He can take a punch from it, which is really nice. And so that then gives you the ability to leverage, if you want to leverage their in-house damage dealers with the Bestigors, you can. If you want to bring in Vexmore and Vashtis, you can. There's just a lot you can do with Spire Tyrants with that base of good netters, even though people seem to not be that interested. And part of it might be a model availability issue. Spire Tyrants have always just been really hard to find. A lot of these warbands are kind of cool that way. Thunderstrike and Warrior Chamber can still just bring a lot of really hard armor that can be really hard to crack with the T6. And Warrior Chamber can do cool things, like if you wanted to do all protectors, you could put a bunch of those into your warband, something like that. Castellites can do these cool reaction control things. I talked about kind of the reaction aura overlap in my last video. You can check out, it was a video about tournament lists that you can still bring to casual tables, and Castellites is perfect for that. Same with Dark Oath, right? Dark Oath has kind of a low win rate, but there are really cool tricks you can do with Dark Oath, like the Whippy Fiend thing that was in my last video, or a lot of the various triples that you get, whether you want to try to shoot the moon with Singri Brand, whether you want to try to do cool things with War Queen Tanari. There's just a lot of fun stuff that you can do that just has just enough of an edge to it that you can run it with a straight face in a tournament, I think. And all of these have that. And I think right now, everything in B tier, I think is just playing really beautiful Warcry for the most part. I mean, some of the things like Horns of Hashut, when they've got you in a corner, can be kind of unpleasant. Tarantulos is kind of stupid, to be honest. And the thing they do of if they just have a million spiders is kind of silly, but their plan B, I think, is really cool, where they have these fast, they're netters, but they're netters that have to be fighting too, and using their abilities to be effective. And so it's they have these thinky netters that is kind of cool. So these fighters or these factions are all a great place to be. As we go up into the A tier, I think that these are all something that's doing something really hard-edged. And I kind of struggled with where to put the factions that just what they do is they synergize with Vexmore. So, for example, Slaanesh Demons, Beasts of Chaos, Slaanesh Sybarites, and Tzeentch, and honestly, to a lesser extent, Khorne. We're seeing Khorne run a lot less with Vexmore recently, just because there's cuter and more fun things to do with Khorne. And honestly, Khorne doesn't really appeal to tryhards. Khorne is a very kind of warband, and so people tend not to put Vexmore with Khorne, even though Vexmore synergizes with what Khorne is doing very, very well. The Blood Reavers are just the absolute perfect thing to be running with Vexmore, but people tend not to do that. And so I struggled with exactly how many points these factions should get for just working well with Vexmore. All I would say is Slaanesh Demons without Vexmore would either be bottom of B or probably top of C. Beast of Chaos without Vexmore would be middle of B. Why is that higher than Demons? Well, they're not quite as tailor-made for Vexmore as Slaanesh Demons are. Part of why Slaanesh Demons benefit so much from Vexmore is that Vexmore can legitimately be their leader. That is Vexmore's home faction, right? So you can kind of cut out some you can cut out your own leader tax if you're playing Demons of Slaanesh, and so that can be very powerful because you can just fit in other stuff. Going into other things, Ruination Chamber, when I was first doing tier lists in this meta, I had Ruination and the other two Stormcasts kind of top of B, trying to figure out which ones were the top ones, but something has happened where the people who want to win with Stormcast have all migrated over to Ruination Chamber, and they have become very, very effective. So you can see, over here, Ruination Chamber with a 57% win rate. It's actually higher than that recently. It's in the 60s recently because people have just been kind of figuring out finally how you're supposed to run Ruination Chamber, and it's been very effective for them. A lot of people are building lists that are more reliant on Reclusians than people were trying before, that have a couple crows, that aren't just putting together a whole bunch of prosecutors. Like, I think you want one prosecutor is what I'm seeing from how people are running them successfully, but you don't want to be like relying on mostly prosecutors. And so people are putting that together, and they're winning with them quite a bit. And so I think that I'm willing to kind of put these guys down to the bottom of B to get Ruination up into the top of A, because I do think they're so effective. I dropped a few things down since my last tier list, and I'll just let's focus in on the top tier right now. Dispossessed and Ogre Maw Tribes have dropped down a little bit. I think Ogre Maw Tribes still benefits from not having to spend a leader tax, and then still gets to have the 3 giant ogre leaders. But Noblars aren't quite as flexible when Cruel Boys can bring Stab Grots and Gut Rippas, and Stab Grots are essentially just better Noblars. So Ogres is still very A tier. They have the best leaders in the entire game. It's not close, by the way. It's not close at all. They have the best leaders in the entire game, and they have very good chaff in Noblars, but they don't have a ton of flexibility outside of that. OverthinkingWarcry.com did a little video on utilizing Gorgers in Ogre Maw Tribes to give them a little bit more of that flexibility, and I think that's worth checking out. I think people should try that out. I think it's probably very powerful, but in general, they're just an inch below. I think I really struggle about whether they should be the bottom of S or the top of A. They are insane, very, very good, but just lately, it's also been shown that if you aren't running one of the sort of flagship leaders of Ogre Maw Tribes, things can degrade very quickly. Like if you're running a Fire Belly as your leader, and then you've got like 2 Iron Guts as your heavy hitters, things can fall apart really quickly with Ogre Maw Tribes, and so that's why maybe they're just a little bit less resilient to misbuilt lists than some of the other things are. As we get really into the top, Slaanesh Sybarites I just think has the best synergy with Vexmore, just because Fiend Bloods fit with them so perfectly. Bliss Brews have that move 5 and are very, very cheap, and so that's what's so great about them. Soulblight has basically, no matter what the pack is, you can build the perfect Soulblight list for it, which I think is really cool, whether you want to be completely swarming, or there's actually been kind of a resurgence in sort of mid-range, high-damage Soulblight lists that use their resurrections and things to feel like they have more bodies than they do, but most of the time are focusing on actually dealing damage. So you can really go a lot of different directions with Soulblight, and you can basically tailor a Soulblight list to be the perfect list for whatever pack you're running and be a main threat to win a tournament. Now, their win rate is never going to be that high because they are insanely popular, and because a lot of the really powerful stuff in Soulblight is from Underworld's warbands. So you're going to want to get the Exiled Dead, you're going to want to get the Crimson Court, you're going to want to get Zandara's whatever's they are. You're going to want to get these 3 Underworld's warbands to mix and match, and then you're still going to want to get like the regular zombies and the White King. I think the White King is like non-negotiable. You're going to want to experiment with a Vampire Lord at some point. So you're going to want so many different things to build like really competitive Soulblight and to be able to make the best Soulblight lists that you're going to be putting yourself in a situation where you're spending almost as much on your Warcry warband as you would on an AOS army, maybe even just as much. And so I think that's why a lot of the Soulblight lists, if they're built maybe a little bit more on a budget, they're going to be a lot less effective. But if you build Soulblight with no budget at all, and you're willing to have a warband that comes from 5 separate boxes, you can make some really scary Soulblight stuff. Royal Beast Flayers, I think I was hesitant for a long time to put them above A tier because some competitive players won some tournaments early in the meta with them, and then people all just kind of put them down because there was this idea that it was really hard to play, which wasn't really true. It was just like a little bit not intuitive, but waiting a bunch is not the hardest thing in the world. No disrespect to Andy and Kyle. I think you guys are amazing at Warcry. I'm just saying, like, it is something that was a lot more approachable than I think people were saying online. And finally, we've seen some people pick up lists that were maybe not quite as tuned as what Andy and Kyle were running and winning tournaments with, but is at least like fairly close in the same ballpark, running a lot of the same models. And they're all going 3-1. So, like, Royal Beast Flayers are the real deal. They're not a popular faction. You're not going to see them in your events. But if your opponent is running, by the way, one of the best models in Warcry is the Royal Beast Slayer leader. But if your opponent is running this thing and a whole bunch of ghouls and a couple barons, you're going to be in trouble because it is incredibly powerful and it is the real deal, even though it's not popular enough to be necessarily a thing. Cruel Boys is just like the classic destruction soup. They get to choose between two different effective chaff that are both good at different roles, which means they get to have just like a lot of very subtle synergies with how they place their models. That just makes it so they just play so smooth and they have the answer for a lot of different situations. They also just have a lot of good abilities that are kind of at their fingertips. They have the 2-up net instead of the 3-up net, which is very silly. Shank is legitimately one of the 5 best models in the entire game, I think, which is so dumb because he's like this little 55-point goober. But I think he might be, yeah, he's definitely one of the 5 best fighters in the whole game. And then, of course, they can access as many ogre leaders as they want because of the soup rules, right? And because their battle trait isn't where they get their power. Speaking of the battle trait being where you get your power, Skaven, just, maybe not quite as crazy. I remember last fall, I was like, I think Skaven are the craziest thing you can possibly imagine. They're the best thing in the game. That was right when they came out with the new rules to reflect the Skaven Tide models. Now we've seen maybe they're not quite as good as they were advertised, but they are real damn close. They are very much belonging in the top tier. Really, the only thing that holds them back is the fact that Wildercore are just so clearly dominant, that Wildercore are just like crushing, maybe they don't win every tournament, but it's like the Wildercore lists are just like rolling over everything they touch for the most part on aggregate. And the matchup just seems to always, like, you might beat Wildercore. Like, I recently won a tournament where I did beat Wildercore, but it was really just because my opponent made just a small mistake with their reaction smart step backward. They just made a small mistake, like positioning with it, or like maybe they should have chosen not to do it, and then our game would have been a draw. And I was playing, like one of the more broken Cruel Boys lists that you can play, but our game just like, the fact that I won was kind of lucky is what I'm saying. And so, like, even though Wildercore doesn't win every time, Warcry is not a game where one player wins every game, or one list can win every game. It is a game where, making that mistake with smart step backwards is important. It can be the difference between a draw and a loss. But Wildercore is the strongest tool you can put in your tool belt, I think. And I think the numbers are pretty clear on that, and so is kind of the theory crafting as well. So last winter, I kind of tried to consolidate these top strategies to also include, like, what are the best ways to run a lot of the weaker lists? Like, a lot of these C and B tier lists can have incredibly powerful builds that maybe aren't sort of the very top of the meta, but are very, very close. And what are the shapes those builds are going to be, right? And so I kind of said, like, you could build an activation dom, you could build wielder guns is what I called it, and then Skaven, Destruction Truck Rally, and Vexmore synergies were kind of their own separate things. One bit of feedback I got, which I thought was pretty legitimate, is that in some ways Destruction Truck Rally, Vexmore, and Skaven are all essentially playing the same game. Those 3 play it so well that none of the other factions can really lay claim to it, and they play it slightly differently from each other. But really, we just have 3 kind of core things that are at the top. These are not the only 3 playstyles in the game. There are dozens of playstyles in this game, but these three do seem to be rising at the top right now based on the factions that can make them work. And gun lines, there's really like 2.5 good gunline factions. You can build Cruel Boys Monster Killers as a gunline if you want, and it can actually be pretty respectable. But that's not seen very often. Horns of Hashut are the same. Horns of Hashut have a pretty low win rate, but they can be leveraged in the right metagames to be able to do a lot of damage at range, and so that can kind of put them in this gunline situation. Someone won a recent tournament that had a lot of players. I think it was like 36 players. They won with a Horns of Hashut warband that was kind of doing the gunline thing. But basically, Wildercore is the flag bearer of this whole group. You can either go lots of little guns or one big gun. If you're going to go one big gun, there are some reasonable options. You can do the Arbalester from Wildercore. You can do the Slan Starmaster as an ally into pretty much anything you want. You can sort of get a lot of interesting Arbalester-like sort of one big gun ideas out of Horns of Hashut or from KO. And then you can do sort of crossbow spam type things. You can kind of do it with KO, but Quan Chi is the other one that works pretty well, a lot like Wildercore, where you are running around doing objectives, and then once you're kind of in the spot you want to be, just all of a sudden your whole warband just like turns and all of you fire on something. And then the next round, all of you turn and all of you fire on something, and you just bring it down every single time. You always have the weight of dice to bring whatever it is you want down, and your opponent just can't hide anything. So any kind of hyper valuable target, any kind of synergy they have, they just can't hide it from you because you have so many different angles to shoot from. These more sort of one big gun ideas are, you just have one thing that's shooting while everyone else is just trying to score points. And the crossbow in Wildercore is pretty silly. So how you run your gun line does really matter a lot. Can you protect your Arbalester? Do you have sort of a few cheap fighters in there to get weight actions in there? Are you reacting with your crossbows or proactively shooting with your crossbows? These are all hard decisions to make, and so playing these gun lines does take a little bit of practice before you can maximize them, but they're all very powerful. It's also something you'll see a lot is there will just be like one melee specialist in there to just kind of hold the line, right? To just if there's something that you're not going to be able to shoot down effectively, you can at least lock it in combat. Activation Dom warbands are basically where you just have cheap enough bodies that you are going last, that you can lead the game with a bunch of weight actions, and then a very silly mechanic that exploits having the last word. So like resurrections do this because you can put things down wherever you want, but so do things like having a really glass cannon damage dealer, like something that's not necessarily a ton of points, that's still letting you get a ton of bodies, but it's like it deals damage like a Titan, but it can't take a hit. So you have to put it behind everything, and you don't want to bring it out until your opponent has been forced to activate all their models. And then once they've activated all their models, then you can bring it out, and then you can attack the thing that you want to hit, right? So like Wielder of the Blade really does that well in Soulblight, for example, or so does Gorath. The other option is you have like Dispossessed or Monster Kill, is you just have one really broken reaction, and so you just wait everywhere, and then your opponent's out of options, and then they have to blunder into your reaction, and then that's when you close the trap and you make them really sad. The other thing is you can have Wildercore and Royal Beast Flayers both have access to this triple that's essentially a proximity mine. So pack tactics, choose an enemy fighter that is visible to this fighter, allocate a number of damage points to that enemy fighter equal to the number of friendly fighters with the RBF and rune mark within 3 of them. So like you surround, like you wait a bunch and then you surround the priority target, and then you just like use this proximity mine and you deal them like 12 damage, and then you get to start hitting them as well, and that works very well. So it's basically, the idea is you just wait a bunch, and then all of a sudden you spring the trap, and there's nothing your opponent can do just because of the simple math of the game. So that's just like a very sort of tried and true way to do well. There are other factions that can do this. Like Tarantulos is good at this. If they get a whole bunch of spiders and then can just keep rezzing them, and they can res them after you've killed them and you're out of activations. Nurgle can kind of do this because they have enough cheap chaff that you can bring in something that's kind of glassy to get some hits in. The Wildercore dog build is completely different from the shooty build, and it is actually very good at this as well. The last kind of archetype that is working for a lot of different people in a lot of different ways is just as long as you have one source of overwhelming offense, like the Gut Lord does this, the Rat Ogres do this, but you can kind of build it in order or death using blessings. Death, it's hard. Like the closest thing you've got is maybe your Askergen Exemplar, but order is easier. You just give a blessing to a some of the Stormcast heroes or like a Hunt Master or something like that, and you just have a ton of offense on one fighter. You have at least one more fighter that is very, very good in a 1v1 situation. Maybe not quite as expensive, but still like very scary. And then after that, you just have a lot of abilities and tricks that synergize with your overwhelming offense things. So, the simplest, most direct way to mess someone up is to just deal them a ton of damage. But you can't put a ton of damage dealers in your list because they're pretty expensive, right? And so that's where you kind of have to create these disruption packages, these point scoring packages into your list to try to supplement your one big damage dealer. And if you can pull that off, you can make these very, very powerful warbands with factions that maybe aren't in the S or A tier. So, for example, the Dark Oath Whippy Fiend list that I talked about in my last video is a really great example of a lower tier faction putting together their sort of structure of a warband that can do this, where the Wilder Fiend, when you are giving it bonus attacks, can deal that kind of no joke damage, and then you just kind of have to build your plan B around the Dark Oath War Queen and all of her little minions. So there's a few different ways to do this, and building these lists I find super fun. This is something that, even though it's like probably over-tuned in certain situations and a little too strong, I hope that we never lose this playstyle, because I think it's the most fun playstyle in Warcry right now, and so I hope that we don't lose it. I hope that even if we maybe nerf the Gut Lord a little bit, nerf some of the top executors of this strategy a little bit, I hope that we remain with like good damage pieces and good tricksy pieces to make these types of warbands work. Just getting into specifics now, I want people to know like exactly like the exact how these are working for these types of things. So like the gun line, this is what a Wildercore gun line looks like. This won a tournament in the hands of Pyotr Lewandowski. When you're theory crafting, mono crossbows seems a lot better, going like 8 crossbows, 7 crossbows, 9 crossbows. But Pyotr won with just 6 crossbows, which is still a lot of crossbows, and had an Arbalester in there and an Arcanaut Admiral, which is a nice little kind of half combat, half combo piece in Kharadron Overlords, as kind of the bodyguard to the Arbalester. And historically, these types of lists with a plan B to them, maybe you're not running as many crossbows, and the twin crossbows are the best fighter in the faction, maybe the best fighter in the game. You're not running quite as many of them, but you have another dimension to your warband, and that seems to have been historically a little bit more successful than running all crossbows. And so that's why I wanted to show this, where this person is just incredibly focused, where they're just going, I'm going to run my leader tax, which I have to run. I'm going to run a giant gun that is going to absolutely destroy people, one bodyguard for that gun, and then I'm going to spend all the rest of my points on the strongest fighter in the game. And that's it. There's, 2 things happening and 1 tax that he's willing to pay, and that's it. This is some, like, textbook example of just, like, very disciplined list writing, and I think people can just bring this exact list and they will do great with it. I think I would co-sign this list for literally any tournament, on almost any pack. The only ones would be like if there's a specific, like, you get slapped on the wrist for taking a ranged attack action. Like, those are the only types of packs where I wouldn't take something like this. Maybe if there was a lot of like weird treasure shenanigans where you really need a move 10 thing, maybe I would combine the Admiral and the Arbalester to get like a big fast fighter in my list. But for the most part, I would co-sign this to anything. I do wonder, Wildercore was kind of waiting in the wings when KO was dominating the shooting life and crushing the metagame. And I do just wonder, if will the best gun in the game always be S tier? That's a question for another day, but I do wonder if that's true, because it has historically been true. In Warcry 1.0, it was the Ogre Thunderfist that was the best gun in the game, and it like really dominated, and was the only thing that could beat Spider Spam, and it was just really, really good and really scary. And then for a lot of 3.0, after monsters were nerfed, where kind of Dragon Maul was kind of the best gun in the game with the 6-inch range. But after monsters were nerfed, KO really emerged, and part of it was because they had the best gun in the game. And now Wildercore has the best gun in the game, and they are the best warband in the game. So I am curious to know if that's just something that's always going to be true, or if it's just we just need to nerf this and then we'll be okay. Talls and smalls, like I said before, it's a very complex situation that's going on, but here are 3 pretty solid examples: one of Skaven, one of Cruel Boys. I'm sorry, I won a tournament with this one in the middle here with Big Perp. The legend of Big Perp continues. If you are confused, Big Perp is a crusher with +1 attack. The model I used for him was big and purple, and my clawback is also big and purple, and so that was essentially the theme of the warband. And then all my KO were green skinned, but they had like purple metal and purple ornaments, and they all had like purple bling on them. And then there were just these 2 big purple people eaters, and that was kind of the visual theme of the warband. But anyway, the legend of Big Perp, he's amazing. Crushers are ridiculous. And then you have Shank, you have the Bullet Boy boss, you have various stab grots doing their thing. Herc can technically all of a sudden explode. I actually used Herc's triple for the first time in my life in this tournament, and it was relevant. So, this is just a warband with 2 really scary pieces to it and a lot of just abilities. And the same's kind of going on with this Vexmore. Vastus and Lassavir have a lot of fancy things they can do. The Fomoroid Crusher just has 34 T6 wounds and a 4/8 attack profile, just like a real chonky boy. And then the Demonettes are fast and they run around. And so these are kind of more concrete examples of what these archetypes look like. I do have my KBZ, my Cruel Boy soup recipe. You need a Bolt Boy boss, although you don't have to. You could do Manok to Cunnin, you could do Dagok, but I like the Bolt Boy boss best. Then Shank, 2 Gut Rippas. One of them probably should be Herc, but it really doesn't matter. A Stab Grot. And then you just pick your 2 favorites of Mega Boss, Crusher, Clawback, Brute Boss, Morgok, and Gut Lord. Those are, I would say, the core of what is making Destruction very powerful in the hands of a competitive player right now. Just 2 of those 5, or is it 5? No, there's 6. 2 of those 6, and you're good to go. And then you just fill out the rest with Stab Grots and Gut Rippas. So here I just had one more Stab Grot, because that's how much room I had. But, instead of Big Perp, you could do a Mega Boss, and then you'd have room to make that Stab Grot a Gut Rippa, for example. Finally, I want to give you an example of an activation Dom. This is Guile ran this at Valencia and won the tournament, or 4-0'd or 5-0'd. This might have been a long tournament. He might have 5-0'd. Either way, he ran like a pretty respectable body count. He didn't have to go that hard with it. This only has 10. A lot of the times you'll see 11 or 12 in Soul Blight. But what he wanted to have was, with the resurrections, he was going to have activation advantage over the mid game, because the first thing they kill, you're going to bring it back, and then probably you'll be able to bring back the second thing they kill as well. And then what you have here is resurrections scale really well with going last, where they can't move or attack, but you can res something onto a spot to score points. You can res something into combat to bog down an opposing fighter. And then Gorath is just super killable, but if you soften something up with like attack actions from these graveguards or these skeletons, you can then have him come in and hit way above his weight class for just a double. So for 130 points, you can have him doing as much damage as something for like around 220 would deal. So that's just kind of a lot of points worth of extra attack power that you can get out of him as long as you've got the last word. He also invested in some speed. And then Graveguard here, we don't usually see Graveguard in successful Soulblight lists, but here it's kind of nice. You give yourself a little bit more offensive firepower, and that's a good thing to have. This is the second to last slide of this, and I am very excited because something that honestly I've been building to wondering about is, when are people going to figure out how to run mid-range? Because there's been a mid-range trap for a long time, and I do think the last two FAQs were both sort of, they included a lot of things that seemed designed to push against it, whether it was big buffs for Underworld's fighters that were kind of mid-rangey, whether it was some nerfs to some of the fighters that invalidate mid-range fighters. You could see them kind of pushing at the boundaries. I think there's still a long ways to go. I think there's entire mid-range archetypes that are floundering. Like, every Chaos Warrior equivalent is bad. That needs to be fixed. But we do have Adepticon, where both of the top players were playing mid-range lists. Austin on the left here with the Royal Decapitator, Zandara, Gorath, who I've already talked about. The Slasher Chrome can deal real damage. And then, just a few cheap fighters that can be rezzed, but are just kind of living their life, running around. And then Chad brought in 3 Reclusians, which have that T6 for a double. They can get their strength way up, so they can really boost their damage output for the cost of a double, which is nice. And then just like a little bit of chaff to hold points and things like that, and just like a little archer. And Yulthari is another mid-range piece. She just has like the wizard bolt, and she's just like very fairly costed. Normally you would just say, well, maybe the vagaries of that specific battle plan actually boosted mid-range. I think something that was very good for that battle plan was or like the battle pack in that tournament, was a lot of people saw it and thought they needed to run swarms, and mid-range is a little bit better against swarms than it can be against some of the other stuff that's out there. But the thing about that is that we've seen these results kind of replicated. Wargames on Toast went 4-0 with a mid-range Soulblight Gravelords that was a little bit different and a little bit completely the same to this list in terms of the approach. The way he was trying to win his games was almost exactly the same as what Austin was doing. And we have seen a ton of people go 3-1 in the UK at various tournaments with lists that are a lot like what Chad ran here. I think Chad's version is significantly more powerful than those lists. Not to like rag on those players, but just like, I think that including the 3 little Sylvaneth allies gives you a lot more flexibility than what a lot of those people were giving themselves. But overall, it's a very similar concept. They were just using Griff Crows instead, which are just, like I said, just a little bit less flexible is all. But I would say these are very much replicated results. And so there is a real, I think, hope here that you can run mid-range if you want to. I think Soulblight and Ruination Chamber are the only ones that have really proven it at scale. But, as long as your threats, your mid-range threats, are tough enough to survive a hit from a Titan. Like the Black Knight has a good, healthy wound pool. The Slasher Crone and the Decapitator are very killable, but they also are capable of rezzing each other back, rezzing these high-profile targets. So you need to have those threats that can survive one hit. Maybe they can't survive two, but then you just back them up with a ton of really good abilities. And Sylvaneth has been doing this for a long time. Sylvaneth has just been kind of floating around B tier for the whole history of second edition. And they're kind of still there. But these lists are basically both just playing like Sylvaneth, but just much more powerfully than Sylvaneth plays. They have these damage boost doubles that Sylvaneth would kill for, where they can get their damage into respectable places, which is the thing that Sylvaneth struggles to do. And I think both of these factions, if you're looking for a completely different playstyle that is, totally separate from what the other really powerful factions in the game are doing, these factions are a really interesting thing to try. I think that there's a real possibility that we could see these types of things continue to have success, and I think that would be really exciting, because I actually really like how the games play out at the top tier of the metagame, but to bring another thing into that would be really cool. The last thing I want to leave you with, I know this has gone pretty long, is what are you likely to face at your tournaments? And these are the 15 factions that have been consistently popular, that in every single I broke up the current meta, the history of the current meta into 3 sections. And these were all the factions that were very popular in all 3, enough that we had reliable win rates for them. And there are individual stories you can tell. So, for example, the hype around egg spam in Monster-Killas died, and so then all of a sudden people stopped running egg spam, and Monster-Killas just fell off a cliff. Egg spam is still really good, but people just got bored of it, and because it's a very gimmicky thing, and so it just kind of fell off a cliff. Or same with Corn, where it's people realized that you could do some pretty good stuff with Corn, and then they just realized that there were other factions that could do that better, and then that was left for just the people who play Corn for the love of the game, which that's separate. Soulblight is the opposite, right? People have slowly figured out how to play Soulblight, where you can't just take a cloud of skeletons, where you have to think about how you're layering your abilities. You have to go buy the Underworld's warbands that you want, that are going to be the most effective. You have to really, plan out your list a lot smarter than you used to have to with Soulblight. And so that's where a lot of people did very poorly with it at the beginning and have just been creeping upwards, because it is incredibly powerful. Crew Boys are kind of just steady, have always just been steadily good. And this is where the 4 factions that are always popular in every section of at all times, they've always been popular, but have also just always been very good, or just are very good right now. Cruel Boys, Wildercore, Skaven, and Soulblight. If I can tell you to prepare for your next tournament, prepare for those 4 factions. Think about, how are you going to punish the Cruel Boys player for relying on Stab Grots for their activations? How are you going to either get in the Wildercore player's face or force them into awkward situations where they have to try to move to score points instead of shooting you, and then you get to punish them for that and maybe slap things when they don't have their reaction up? How are you going to get all of your damage onto the Rat Ogre in Skaven without being forced into fighting the Packmasters? How are you going to reduce the effectiveness of resurrections? Are you going to be able to reach out and touch the leaders in Soulblight without having to deal with some of the chaff? Are you going to be able to go out and preemptively take down a Gorath before he has time to act like a 220 point fighter. These are things that you need to be preparing for if you want to win a tournament. Whereas there are still a lot of other really powerful factions in the game, but I would say you could get away with not thinking about them as much and just not facing them. These are the four powerful factions that you are likely to face at pretty much every big tournament that you're going to go to. I just don't think you can really win a tournament in very many parts of the world right now. There are a few, like, some big UK tournaments won't have a ton of people on these archetypes. But for the most part, in every other part of the world, if you're going to an event, you're going to see people bringing these four factions and bringing fairly scary versions of them. And that's what you should prepare for. So I hope next time you play one of those four, you are prepared and that all of your rolls are crits.